I want to welcome everyone to this final session of Accessibility in Education. It's a four-part series on how inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility all impact the jobs that we do. Our presenters, I will let everyone talk about themselves a little bit, and we'll start with Willie.
Thank you, sir. Hey, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're located geographically. Willie Franklin, retired senior technology specialist from Otterbein University and life member of ETC. And glad to be with you here this afternoon.
Thanks, Willie. Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Havivelli. I am Assistant Director of Online Learning at Tulane University's Freeman School of Business.
Thank you, Sarah. I am Rick Nimps. I am an AV design consultant at the University of Notre Dame. And so what are we going to learn today? We're going to learn about accessibility, what it is, accommodation, and we're going to learn the difference between the two. Who needs access, and what types of access do they need? We'll talk about the stakeholders involved in the process, building our rooms so that people can actually use them. And we're going to talk about the rooms themselves, and we'll talk about how what we're going to talk about doesn't have anything to do with money. It's more morality. And on this webinar, we have tried to make it accessible for everyone. Captions are turned on. This is being recorded and will be available later. And as you see, sort of in the middle, there's a link for a tiny URL session link. Steve, could you send that through chat again so that people that joined recently can get that link? And I will say that if we are speaking too fast for you or not clearly enough, let us know in the chat or just unmute yourself and say something. We want everybody to be able to participate in this. So, what is accessibility? The dictionary definition says that it's being easy to approach, enter, and speak with ease, and just be able to be part of. The difference between accessibility and accommodation is really spelled out in a slide that we found at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Accessibility is a proactive process where we think about and we plan for someone's accommodation that will be needed in the future. And accommodation is someone who needs a certain physical or maybe even a mental change in the way that they interact with the things that we provide. When it's when somebody asks us for something and then it's provided for them. So here's a little exercise that we can think about. How are you or somebody that you know affected and may need access? And as I was looking over these slides earlier today, I realized that I personally have been affected by all these. Not people that I know, but me personally. Some of the ones we think of, the visual and the auditory and the motor, those are pretty easy. But the whole cognitive and the mental health, maybe somebody, an anxiety thing, or they just don't feel like they can participate. And the speech, I intentionally put that last part in type that's very hard to read because I wanted to simulate what it's like for somebody who just cannot speak up. We have a math professor here at Notre Dame who talks in a very low voice right next to the chalkboard and wonders why her class can't hear her. Does anybody have any others that they would want to add or amplification on any of these before we move on? Just unmute yourself and speak right up if you like. And let me expand a little bit on the speech. And it's not just because nobody spoke up, but there are people in a situation like this, a group situation, that don't want to speak up because of something, an anxiety or whatever. And there are also people, and I'm one of these, who have a stutter or a stammer. And there are times when the word is there, it wants to come out, but for some reason, my muscles just can't make it work. And sometimes I substitute another word for it, or maybe I just don't say anything. These are all things to be aware of as we design our spaces. So who are the stakeholders? Well, it's not just one or two, there are a whole lot. There's the administration, they're the stakeholders, because in most institutions, they're the ones that are responsible for the money and the image of that institution. There's the faculty. They use the technology that we have. I spoke about the math professor that we have. They teach students, and faculty themselves may need accommodation. We have had faculty that we've had to have an online transcriber transcribe everything that's going on in the class for them because they're hearing impaired. There's staff, the people like us. We're number one on the front line for when something doesn't work. This audio system is bad. I can't hear. I can't see the projector. That's the kind of thing that we get into. And then we have to build the systems that become an accommodation. And we ourselves may need some type of accommodation. Then there are the students. They're pretty much the ones that pay the bills. They're the ones that give us money so that we can have a paycheck. And it's mostly the students, I think, that we're concerned about when we talk about someone that needs accommodations. We have integrators. They're a stakeholder too, because in most institutions, they're a partner that help us design and build AV systems that people can use. And we have architects. At our institution, they're generally involved in larger building projects. And the nice thing about architects is they've done this kind of thing a lot. And they have a broad, robust knowledge of how spaces are used and the laws around them. Then we have vendors and service providers, people that we actually hire to come in and do things, and they may need to have some type of accommodation themselves. Then we have our visitors, people who come to see students. Think of the grandparents at graduation. Think of event attendees at convocations or entertainment things that happen on campus, and the mobility challenged. And why are they stakeholders? Because they are all affected by the accessibility portion of what we do. Why is including stakeholders important? Because including them saves time and money. It's easier to build something right the first time than it is to retrofit it. And including people lets them know that they are valued. Everybody has a different need. Some needs may not be the same as others. And we don't know what people need unless people tell us. At Infocom, one of the sessions I went to, they said that the majority, like over 80% of people that need an accommodation have an invisible disability. Maybe the voice thing that I talked about, maybe hearing, maybe the vision. Those are all things that, you look at somebody across the room and you would think, well, they're not disabled. They don't need any accommodation. Another thing we can do is conduct a survey to find out what we need, get our planning committees for our spaces involved, so that in a group like this, there are people that have experienced a need for an accommodation, something I talked about a few slides ago. And, we can draw on our personal experiences, or I heard of somebody that needs something. And so let's talk about it, and let's do it right the first time. And Willie is going to tell us all about stakeholders.
Rick, thank you very much. Rick, you can give me that stat ton and tons of time again and again with regards to 80% of folks just not being recognized for having a need. And it's because we're not asking, not so much that we're not looking, it's because we're not asking. So surveying is very important, and stakeholders are very important. So for this piece of the webinar, I want you to all think conceptually like your stakeholders are individuals within a city that comprise the network of, or your community, on your campus, in your corporate environment, whether they're visitors, VIPs, administrators, vendors, integrators, the whole 9 yards. We're not talking here today about one-off solutions. We're talking about building in accessibility, and much as Rick had indicated, this has to be a proactive approach in order to be successful. That said, stakeholder management is very important throughout this whole process. So as we begin to explore what stakeholder management is all about, I want to share with you a couple of key elements of that. So we'll proceed to the next slide here and looking at why stakeholder management is important. Projects fail not because of lack of interest. Projects tend to fail because stakeholders' needs sometimes are ignored. That, of course, leads to lack of buy-in. And when people don't have buy-in, they're not coming to the table. They're not going to put their necks on the line with registering their thoughts, right? So for any project to be a success, you've got to have buy-in, not only from the person who's sharing that information of what needs to be done, but from the entire community of stakeholders that are there to communicate their needs to you. Once again, surveying is very important. Communication is very important. So with the next slide here, I'm going to lay out 5 strategic approaches, if you will, for stakeholder management. You definitely want to avoid and resolve conflicts between stakeholders. And that's simply an aspect of competing priorities. We all deal with it every single day in our home and work environments. So when you gather those folks around the table, or when they're meeting on Zoom, they're going to be competing priorities. And your task, one of, is to address and resolve that. And that's going to help generate buy-in from your stakeholders, right? Because you're having open communication. And the communication with stakeholders is one of the key ways of securing that buy-in. The last 2 points on effectively managing the stakeholders is managing expectations. Nothing infuriates me more than sitting in and being a part of a project where there is not a clearly articulated vision. In other words, a start point and an end goal, what I can expect at the end. If you think back for a moment at the very start of this webinar, we shared with you, or Rick shared with you, what you're expected to learn out of this. So having those expectations set at the very start and continuing that conversation throughout that whole process is going to be of strategic importance. Monitoring stakeholder engagement, that is best done by openly communicating with everyone who's at the table. And again, that table can be physical with regards to being in a room, meeting online. For me, for all the projects that I've managed, it's certainly been one-on-one communication with people as they were present in the meeting, but it's also been hallway conversations. It's been an intentional email or a follow-up phone call. Not everyone in that environment, not all of your stakeholders are going to be forthcoming with conversation, right? Who are going to be responsive to the questions that they're asked, who are going to share their opinions when it's time to get input. So it's incumbent upon you to reach out to each of those individuals to make certain that they're remaining engaged in that process from start to finish and their opinions are valued. Nothing says I'm valued more than, well, tell me what you think, right? So you want to call people into the conversation instead of calling them out on having an idea. So as we transition to the next slide here, it's important that you ask yourself, how do I go about identifying some of those key stakeholders? Because it's obvious that you have an entire community of individuals there, and you wouldn't get anything done if there were 400 people around that conference table or on the Zoom session as part of your project planning process. So that said, a couple of 5 points here to share. The next 2 points I'll share with you will be, you want to find out who's interested in the project. And it goes back to surveying. It goes back to assessing what value that project will have on my faculty, on the students, on visitors, on AV integrators, on VIPs. When you open the door to conversation, you'll find out pretty darn quickly who is interested in seeing that project going forward. And you'll also find out who have the power to help it succeed. And those are typically the people who control the budget, right? It is also very important that you understand during that whole process of identifying and asking yourself, who are my stakeholders, that you are really realistic that there are some people who are a part of that stakeholder group for no other reason than to see it fail. And it's not that they dislike you. It's not like they don't believe in the project, but those individuals may indeed have competing priorities, something of critical importance to them, and they don't want to see the budget dollars consume, or the time, or even the time as it relates to meetings consume to see your project come to fruition. So again, it's not about you, it's about the project. So make certain you're not taking it personal, but bring your personal self into it, if that makes any sense. And the last piece here is identifying those people who want to see your project succeed. Those are going to be the people who are quick to come to the table or quick to share ideas, and some who are not so much quick to share ideas because maybe they do hold back on dialogue and they don't like being the center of attention, but they will definitely let you know how important that project is to them, how important access is to them, how important inclusion is to them. So as you've worked to identify them, you want to make certain that you're always consistently using a wonderful tone with all of your stakeholders. A little note about tones and tactics here. Verbal and nonverbal communications happen 24/7 in our work and home environment. So you want to be cognizant of that. Now, here's an example of a poor tone, if you will, and that's to walk into that meeting setting and basically say to people, if changes are not made regarding access, this company is going to face a lawsuit. To lead with the notion of punishment due to inaction is not the best foot forward. So you definitely want to have more of a positive tone. And by that, I think this statement really articulates it well from a standpoint of say, hey, I've noticed a couple of access issues that I believe are important, and I'd like to share those with you. So again, you're calling people into the conversation, right? Versus calling them out for any aspect of inaction, if you will. So your positive tone is always going to be your best foot forward, because you're looking to build rapport with your group of stakeholders, and you're looking to keep that level of engagement every single time. A last point here to reiterate on the last slide, just to reinforce it, you're looking to invite people into the conversation. Your project management, when it comes to access and accessibility, need not be cumbersome, need not be emotionally draining. You don't have to do all of work, that is why you're building this core group of stakeholders that are taking on that project with you from start to finish. You're communicating with them, you're resolving competing projects, and you're doing it in such a way that you're not coming across as being neutral, right? You want your folks to see that you are indeed emotionally invested, because the I'm not emotionally invested approach, well, frankly put, it just doesn't work. You don't want people to get the sense that you just don't care, that this is just an assigned obligation. So you want to put your whole self into it, but you need not drain your whole self in the process. So I hope this little segment about how important our stakeholders are has been informative for you, and how managing stakeholders can help aid in your success and managing and seeing your project come to fruition and be a complete success for you. I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah at this point.
Hello, everybody. We're going to talk about accessibility in physical spaces. So accessibility does affect higher education in a lot of different formats, right? You have physical media like textbooks, digital course media like videos, software needs to be accessible, tools like learning management systems. But for, I would say, the majority of people within the ETC organization, there is some part of your job that's going to be going into physical spaces. So we wanted to talk about physical spaces today as our sort of starting point. Most of the time when you're going into a retrofit or a renovation or new construction, the institution that you work for already has some sort of basic plan for accessibility when they're going into a physical space, but there are some common features that you would see if you're doing a renovation. Next slide, please. There we go. And I think it's really important, as somebody who is planning to have some of these conversations, to just try and make yourself as familiar as you can with as many options. Some of these, as Rick sort of touched on earlier, are things that we automatically have come to our minds, right? So like ramps within spaces that have an incline instead of stairs, automatic doors. Some of them we think of less. Desks, chairs, and tables with adjustable heights. So someone in a classroom who's not as tall, or who uses some sort of mobility aid, and so they're a little bit lower to the ground or possibly higher. Microphones and speakers are pretty common in large spaces, especially classrooms, but those are actual tools that can be used for accessibility. Listening assistance devices, we have content magnification tools, just all kinds of things in general that it's just good to be as familiar with as you possibly can. So the goal is always going to be to try and make as many spaces as you can on campus or in your company as accessible as possible. But it's also not necessarily realistic to know that every single space is going to perform the function that you need, right? Funding and resources are limited. So we encourage you to try and use tools to basically create documentation. So like checklists, best practices, and a list of what tools each space has. So think, for example, about someone who's updating a computer lab, right? If you had a set of standard accessible classroom rack equipment that you're putting into that space, that would be invaluable. Or somebody who books out spaces for the engineering department at your university. If they have a student or a faculty member who needs to amplify their voice, right? Or who needs voice amplification in a listening assistance device, knowing which spaces in sort of that school's general area of classroom buildings have those tools makes it easier to put that person into that space and make sure that they're going to be successful. So a variety of stakeholders can access that repository of information for planning, making changes, and then it can even be used for single instances of accommodation. So the big thing is what happens when our space doesn't work, right? So we have gone through the process of making sure that as many of our spaces are as accessible as possible. Well, we know that there are still going to be times where you might have someone that comes in that needs something extra, right? So the first thing that will likely happen is that you get an accommodations request from one of your universities and institutions, accessibility partners, because I know we do have some corporate members that can be a little bit different. For higher education, specifically in terms of the educational institution side, though, it's also not uncommon to have more than one accessibility partner. So at my university, we have a student center, but then we also have sort of an HR side that is for staff and faculty. So just be aware, as somebody working within this space, you may be reached out to by multiple people, right? And then when you do have to factor in for this single instance accommodation, you want to look for solutions that are basically portable and reusable. So for example, a screen reader that magnifies for, say, a faculty member that's in a classroom, that's not necessarily something you're likely to see across your entire campus. It's an excellent single instance accommodation. If you can find a piece of equipment that's both portable and reusable in different spaces, then you can use this over and over again as this individual is teaching. You want to make sure that the solutions you look for are also affordable. You know, it's amazing to be able to spend the most that you can to get the most cutting edge tool in place, but it's also just not realistic for most of us, whether we're corporate or we're on the higher education side. The biggest thing for me also, I think, is that it needs to be convenient for the user, right? We want people who need access to have a low burden of entry when they're engaging with solutions, not a heavier one. So the cost of complying with ADA requirements, right? It's a conversation that I feel like a lot of educational institutions have. We know we need to spend the money, but we want to spend it wisely. You know, ADA compliance requires us spending it. If we plan, we don't have to go back in and redo spaces. You know, starting conversations too late just costs more money. Like you need to go in and say, add additional electrical for something in your rack, or you need to go in and add additional drops for internet, right? All of those things are incredibly expensive. And a lot of people would say, you know, not complying with ADA regulations is expensive. There have been so many lawsuits in the news, and we've even covered them, instances in some presentations I've attended at ETC over the last 10 years where the university didn't comply or the institution didn't comply, had to pay out a settlement, and then also still had to spend the money to allow the person to have access to a tool or device or individual, whatever it is, that allows them to move forward, right? So these are all parts of the cost argument. But while thinking about cost is necessary, it's also the least effective argument when you're trying to convince stakeholders to prioritize accessibility. So what are effective tactics, right? So much of the resistance we think of when discussing accessibility with stakeholders centers on money, but what generally has been found to work in this sphere is actually appealing to emotions, making a personal appeal. One of the first ways you can do that is to increase awareness, right? And that's just another great reason why it's so important to make sure that you look at disability across those 5 segments that we talked about, right? 80%, like Rick said, of people have an invisible disability, right? And then educate yourself on those things as much as you can. And then you want to try and create empathy, right? You want to identify with the situation of the person that is going through this. And then one of the best ways to do that is to just ask direct questions about exclusion. It can feel complicated and hard, but if you use positive tone, like Willie had said before, we have 2 sample questions here that are really great conversation starters, right? They're not accusatory. They are very just very aligned with getting somebody to really think about how changing access or creating access for someone could feel. So the first one we have is, do you feel like this person's difference means that they should be excluded, right? And then the other one we have here is, what other group of people besides those requiring access have to prove their value before we care about their needs, right? Just, I wouldn't say they're in your face, but they're very specific. It sort of makes you think like, okay, no, this is a really, really important thing, right? So, what are some other effective tactics beyond just awareness, empathy, and asking some direct questions, right? So one is to identify the stakeholder who controls your spending, right? Because you're going to be dealing with a group of stakeholders, but one person or one or two people usually hold the purse strings, forgive me. And that person sometimes, or people, have a little bit more sway on how things move. So it's really important to see if you can determine the goals and motivation for that stakeholder, along with anyone else who's on your side. Like Willie had said, identify your people who want you to succeed by asking questions, right? Being open, keeping a positive tone. And then if it's possible, you want to use that information to craft your argument. So for example, if you're talking with somebody who wants the university to have cutting edge technology, right? Factor how assistive technology can be cutting edge into your discussion as to why you should be making this change. Or if someone's really about student experience, right? Explain how many people need and use these tools and benefit from these tools that are students, right? Or even faculty experience. There are a certain number of faculty members that need accommodations and access just like students. So if it's possible, try and craft that into your argument, into your discussion, right? And then lastly, one of the, I think the single most important factor to implementing accessibility is executive sponsorship. And this is basically a high-level executive or administrator, somebody who's working to foster both like common knowledge and pursuit of a goal like accessibility, right? If somebody in higher leadership is on board with the idea of creating accessibility, or you can get somebody on board, they are just a great motivator for bringing more people, like a magnet to your discussion and to why this is so important to do beyond just the basic stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to Rick for a summary.
Thank you, Sarah. And so anybody that knows the teaching method, we tell you what we're going to tell you, we tell you, and then we tell you what we told you. And this is the tell you what we told you part. We learned the difference between accessibility and accommodation. And accessibility is having a plan, and accommodation is more of a reactive, removing barriers to someone. We learned about who needs access and what type of access they need. And more people than not, more disabilities are invisible than are visible. And there are a lot of stakeholders. Willie talked about those, why we need them, how we can include them, and importantly, how we can talk to them. That goes along with the strategies for managing them. And Sarah brought out the physical space, which is something that a lot of us think about when we talk about having accommodation. And one big thing was the morality thing. A way that I like to think about this is, well, I'm not going to spend money to put whatever accommodation in. And by doing that, I am telling you that you are not important enough to be included in this space. So just go away. That's a little more in your face than what Sarah had, but that's the way that I like to think about it. If anybody has more questions or wants to know more, our contact information is on this slide. And I just want to say we are not the smartest people in the world. I don't know that anybody on the team that put this together knew a lot about it. before we did it. We have resources and links to things. One, I want to draw attention to this last bullet point, the GitHub poster. That was something that we showed at the last conference that we had in Los Angeles last year. And it brings about an awareness of the various disabilities. And, I don't even know if we need to call them disabilities. I mean, think of somebody with autism. Somebody with autism would be uncomfortable, or certain types of autism would be uncomfortable in a Zoom meeting like this, with the people looking and then knowing that people are looking at you. And, I can't say that that's a disability, because it's just a way that somebody else processes information. We need to be aware that just because somebody is not like us doesn't mean that they're wrong or bad. There were other presentations in this. We had an introduction, and then talked about disability, and then digital accessibility and accessibility in physical spaces. In the slides, there are links to the recording. And a couple of the sources that we used for this slide were the University of Wisconsin, where they talked about the difference between accessible or accommodation and accessibility. And there was an excellent webinar. It's this last thing by 3Play Media. And the focus of that webinar was how to make your digital presence accessible to others. But they had a lot of good points, and this point about the emotional argument of why do you not want to build accessibility, and by doing so you are excluding me. That was something that we gleaned from that webinar. So if you are affected by this and want to know more, I highly suggest that you check out those reference materials. We have a little bit of time. We can have an open discussion. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can all look at each other uncomfortably, like we're all used to doing on Zoom meetings. And if you have a question or comment or just want to say something, just go ahead and go for it.
Rick, Sarah, for the record, I'm never uncomfortable looking at the two of you and always enjoy working with you. But more to the point, I much as Rick is saying, I'd love to hear from you all with regards to projects that you've managed, been a part of, meetings with stakeholders, just to share your experiences. And to help launch that invitation, I'll just share one of mine. One of our crowning glories on my former campus is our makerspace. Getting the best of technology into that space was just really eye-opening. To have that level of budget was absolutely great. To design a building that was very welcoming to visitors with regards to ease of access, kind of like walking into a grocery store where you approach the doors open, so you don't have to try to balance the weight of the door if you have mobility challenge to even enter the building. If you're not comfortable with talking to strangers, there's wayfinding that would greet you right there, that would guide you through the building, either with a touch, or you could stand long enough and watch the screen, kind of give a lay of the land. So it was very inviting of a space. However, with all of that came enormous challenge of dealing with a couple of key stakeholders, some who held the budget and were very adamant about making certain that their goals were put in place. Some of their goals included designing spaces that really didn't work well from a safety entrance and exit standpoint. In other words, imagine going into a room that has an occupancy of almost 200 seats, and instead of having broad doorways to enter, you had two narrow doorways that were not ADA well, they were ADA compliant from a width standpoint, but you have to physically open that door. You couldn't just push a button. You didn't have a choice of pushing a button to have the door open. If you have mobility issues, you had to grab the handle of this rather weighty designer door. So there were instances like that, that being on the committee, having a voice meant, yes, you're hearing that competing priority. You know the obstacle it's likely to present at the end of the project, but how do you keep things going forward, and how do you keep that person really engaged without calling them out for what I still consider a bad choice? So if you have experiences like that, please share. And this is a learning opportunity for us all.
I don't have answers to that question. I guess one of the things that I was thinking about in coming to this was things like podium design, sort of thing that I sort of came to this university. They sort of had a design of podiums. They had some wings on the side. The wings always seem to be used for these big document cameras. We designed some new podiums. I had a chance to design new podiums, and now we're using little document cameras. I'm like, I don't need the wings anymore. I put the document camera right on the top, and I can. And then later on, after I made it, I was like, oh, those wings were also for people that might be in a wheelchair to put a laptop on us. And it's like, where should I have seen that information? Like, it's not obvious right at first. And no one, the person designing the podiums didn't come up with a plan that said, here's our accessible podium, right? Where do you even get that information? And then how do you figure out, well, for the person that's standing, having the keypad at the back of the podium, that's great. You can reach back there and touch it. Well, for the person in the wheelchair, it should be at the front. But if it's at the front, then it's in the way of the person who's standing. I still haven't seen a podium and said, oh, that's the perfect podium, right? So we might even know what some of the questions are, but I don't quite know where to look for some of these answers.
One of the things I learned last year on a project was we've got these tables with the cable cubbies halfway between the people sitting across from each other. And they had an actual ADA consultant that came through and evaluated things after it was done. And that consultant said, no, you don't do that and have those, because how can somebody who can't get up out of their chair look in there and see what's there? And, to be honest, how can I look in there? How many times have we looked inside those and wonder what's there? How do I get it out? And how do I use it? And so their answer was along the edge of the table kind of thing. Make something accessible that way everybody can get to it.
I think that's why it's so helpful to have centralized lists and the executive sponsorship too, if you can get those two things together, because then you have more chance of creating a culture where if someone is moving into a new role, or if you're going into a new project, you have better access to resources that are already in place on campus, or projects that you've already done. I mean, it's amazing if you can have an accessibility coordinator, but not everyone has that. I'm not technically part of our IT and media services department anymore, but I know that we're upgrading some classrooms. And I had said to someone like, hey, if you're looking at podiums, like, you should really think about like the up and down, because we have some that are getting replaced that used to move up and down, but they're so old now that technology is broken. The manufacturer no longer exists. No one can repair it. And it's a potential problem. And so having, I think, like I said, just resources, a list of things that you can go to start off is really great. I also think if anybody here is interested in learning more, there's a great concept that's taught in a lot of places for design called Universal Design for Learning. right? And the idea behind universal design for learning is that the more accessible we make a space, the more people can engage with it, right? And that can be an online space or a physical space, but they show some great examples in a class that I took where it was like, this ramp is really beautiful, but the entire, like half of the ramp is ramp and half of the ramp is stairs, and you can't tell the difference. So it's accessible in terms of someone with a mobility aid could get up, but somebody with a vision aid, with a vision impairment may not be able to tell the difference between where the ramp ends and where the stairs ends. So if you're looking for general resources on common accessibility features, Universal Design for Learning is a great place to start.
Those are all some great examples. I'll toss one more in, and it's truly about lived experiences. A colleague of mine was, I consider him having a level of mastery when it came to wire management. But he did it to the point of a flaw, right? So imagine, Scott, as you were talking about podiums, and in a couple of instances where he had equipped a podium, got everything set up, and I just marvel at just the cleanliness of the job that was done. And I said to him, I said, well, why so tight on the wiring for the keyboard and the mouse? And he says, well, what do you mean? It's easy to utilize. I said, but what if the user is left-handed? There's zero mobility here. It's like fixed at this point. So as you mentioned, Scott, with regards to the wing, there are aspects of our experiences that we know in real time, right? We're living it, we're breathing it. But what about others? And Sarah, as you mentioned, of having kind of a guide, a playbook to reference from, how do we know what to take into consideration when we're equipping spaces, when we're designing spaces beyond ADA compliance, right? How do we know what the end user needs and expects if we're not asking, if we're not listening? And Rick, as you touched upon, if 80% of those needs are unknown to us, we're really operating at a deficit. So always being positioned to encourage conversation, to invite that dialogue is our best foot forward. And it's okay to make mistakes. Not one of us is a keeper of all knowledge. So venture out there, explore, gain those experiences, come back to sessions like this to share those experiences. Any one of you with endless budget out there when it comes to equipping spaces? I'd like to hear from some of those folks who have zero challenge of getting that wish list fulfilled.
Yeah, Willie, now you're looking for unicorns.
I'd like to add too that I know that we may not necessarily have as many corporate members in the session, but hopefully people will view the recording over time. But as a stakeholder coming to that conversation, I think it's also so helpful to feel like you have that information going in, right? The features of your product, how your product might integrate with other products. It's not necessarily going to, because we said it's not a money argument, sell something more, but it does make such a huge difference to the people that you're working with, to know that you're thinking about it, right? And you can take that back to your company as well. And, maybe slightly different tactics in not a specifically higher education environment, but, it's just important all around.
No, absolutely. And we've actually been delving in here in Lona on VPATs because we're starting to get some organizations requesting those. And that's been something new for product management to deal with. There are several consultants out there that will help you write them for a Again, unlimited budget, that's an option. We've also discovered some tools on AI that can help write VPATs. So thinking that might be a topic of discussion going forward.
And I didn't know what VPAT was, so I Googled it, and it's a voluntary product accessibility template.
Yeah, so if they're using federal money, if your institution's using federal money, you might be required to start applying those if product is being spent, right? And if that federal money is being spent on products, then that you may have to have a VPAT associated with that product. And yeah, I didn't know a whole lot about it. I reached out to Cecile and she gave me a bunch of stuff. And then I reached out to a consultant that educated me. And wow, the bill for getting them to do the evaluation was quite high. So like I could pay for a small city in foreign country to go live in for a while I did the VPAT.
I will also say that if the barrier to entry for this seems really high, it felt that way for everybody on our committee putting this together. And I think in the last year to 2 years that we've existed, we've all learned so much in general about inclusion, diversity, accessibility, equity, and access. So it does just take time. You just have to take one step at a time to move forward to learn about this stuff.
We've got about 2 minutes left in this session. Is there anything else anybody would like to add before we adjourn? Okay, thank you all for attending. I appreciate the discussion afterwards, and I hope that you are all walking away with something to think about and something to add to our arsenal of knowledge that makes us valuable to our institutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Rick, Sarah, always a pleasure, guys.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.